So my EPQ is on the rise of racism in the UK towards the Indian migrant community from 1948 to 1987. So I chose this topic because of my heritage as an Indian. I don't think that racism towards this community is talked about enough, as much as other ethnic minorities. And I kind of wanted to discover this ethnic minorities' journey from India to the UK and the harsh nature of it, to not only give me but others an appreciation for what they had to go through. And probably my main inspiration for this topic was the movie Blinded by the Light, which I went to go see last year. And it was prior to this that I didn't really know, understand, or even think about the problems faced. And I think there was a lot of personal issues in it that I could really connect to, and I wanted to discover that further. And the reason I chose that timeline from 1948 to 1987 was because in 1948 was when the British Nationality Act was put in place. And so this is when the most mass immigration started to take place. And it ended in 1987 because it was towards the end of Margaret Thatcher's time in office. And during this time, there was a lot of correlation between the rising unemployment rates and racism faced. So how did I research my EPQ? So I started off by creating a timeline and trying to find information that way. So I started in 1948 and ended in 1987. And I was trying to pick out key events that took place and try and collate information as well with my interviews that I did, so that I had more reliable information in terms of what actually happened, because you know that getting what actually happened to people is the most important way of getting information. And what did I find difficult? I think the most difficult thing for me was finding reliable information, especially for unemployment rates. There were so many sources, even academic sources, that were saying different things. And in fact, it was really hard to find out. So I managed to find out a PDF file that had the statistics. It was the National Statistics Service, and I had to dig deep. So it was about digging deep for that information, but it was still retrievable. And I stayed interested mainly by finding out what was actually going on. I think if you go through this journey and you find the information, that it was just easy to stay interested. I didn't think it was hard, and I didn't really think throughout that, I didn't want to carry on doing this topic. So how has racism changed? So I did it in a timeline to kind of show that transition from 1948 to 1987. So in 1948, the British Nationality Act was put in place, and in 1951 was when mass immigration started to take place, where 60,000 Indians travelled to Britain. And they came over mainly because of the harsh poverty that was going on in India at the time, as well as the Indian partition of 1947, where there was really harsh conflict going on. So the Indians at the time kind of took this opportunity to kind of get away from the conflict that was going on there. And I'll come back to the National Front, but it was interesting to see that over the 40 years, the racism that was faced. They knew that there would be racism, but it was the severity of it that was that they couldn't quite predict. So in 1968 was when the first Race Relations Act was put in place, and that banned and made it illegal for anyone to refuse employment or housing based on their race. And as you can see, this is 20 years after immigration started to take place, and it was interesting to see government incentives to kind of restrict that. It took them a while to do so. And yes, it did show that racism and discrimination was increasing so much that they had to put that in place. But they can kind of be criticised for doing it so late. And the importance of the National Front being set up in 1967 is they were a far-right fascist party that really disliked immigration, and they wanted to and they thought that Indians and other ethnic minorities were polluting the British population, and they had a really active role in the 1970s and 80s. They participated, and they set up a lot of riots, and in particular the riot of 1977, the Battle of Lewisham, which was very controversial as at this time, Lewisham was a very diverse city, and it was thought that the National Front were basically parading through to antagonise the population there. And in 1968, I think 1968 was a really key turning point, and especially Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. It was really important because this was the first time that a major MP had spoken out about racism, immigration, and I think the National Front and the Indigenous population as a whole really took this form of leadership to allow them to create some sort of active opposition against the Indian immigrant community. It was prior to this that, yes, there was racism that took place, but it was more individual acts of racism. So some of the interviews I did, I found that it was the derogatory term "paki" was being thrown around a lot, and people urinated through the Indians' letterboxes and things like that. But it was after 1968 that it really took a hold, like I said, with the Battle of Lewisham. And from 1978, when Margaret Thatcher came into power, unemployment was really starting to rise. So at the height in 1982, the unemployment rate was at 14%, and it was in the 1950s and 1960s that it was only around 3-4%. So as you can see, there was this massive increase in unemployment. And it kind of reflected badly onto the Indians and other ethnic minorities because they were blamed for taking jobs that the indigenous population wanted. And yes, increasing unemployment took place, which created large discontent. And it led to conflicts happening not only in Lewisham, but all around the country, in Liverpool, in Bradford, Birmingham, and big cities especially. And in 1987, this is when the movie Blinded by the Light was set. And it really reflected the conflict that was taking place, not only about, it mentions Enoch Powell, but also how unemployment really affected them and how that reflected on the racism and the discrimination that they experienced themselves. And so it's really interesting to see that in 1948 and in 1950s and 60s, there was racism prevalent, but then how that escalated towards the 1970s and 80s. So yeah. So my overall findings. So as I said, there was a lot of racism in the 1950s and 60s, and that then escalated. But initially, my thought was the change in racism. You'd expect there to be a lot of racism when they first came to the country, and that would slowly diminish over time. But that kind of trend was flipped over, where in the 1950s and 60s, there was discrimination and racism, but it was quite restricted, I think, into single acts of racism. And it was only into the 1970s and 80s that it really started to take a hold, and that there was this kind of front to racism. There was this active opposition that really came together against them, which led to the conflict that was taking place. There was some sort of way for Indians to come together to fight against racism. The Asian youth movements were set up in places like Bradford, and they were kind of trying to defend themselves against racism and discrimination, but the movement was very much limited as it wasn't organised properly, so it had a very limited impact on how racism actually impacted them. So yeah, that was my EPQ journey.